That's a good sound. Good sound. Now, one thing we haven't mentioned, because we have a webinar later this year, is about swing weighting. But if you're using tip pins for swing weighting, you want to do that now. You want to epoxy the pin to prevent it from either coming loose or causing a rattle. So your ferrule should already be in place by now. But if you only have it on partially, because you're using the tip pins for swing weighting, then you want to seat the shaft in the hosel. Just make sure that there's at least 3/4 of an inch of the shaft tip in the hosel when you're doing this. So you want to grab the head in one hand and place your other hand on the shaft approximately a foot down from the top of the hosel. Now, holding the shaft tightly on the head, you want to drive the shaft against the floor or metal plate and continue this process until you can feel or even hear the shaft bottom out in the hosel. When installing the shaft, you want to notice the position of the silk screen. Okay, this is usually very prominent on a graphite shaft, or it's located near the bottom or the first step on a steel shaft. You want to install the shaft with this aligned in the proper manner. Cosmetically, you normally see the silk screen up or at the 12 o'clock position as if you were looking at a clock, while others prefer it at 6 o'clock or underneath the shaft, so it's not visible when you set the club at address. Now, if you're building multiple clubs at a time, the number of the club should be noted on the shaft with a Sharpie pen or something to identify which club it goes into. You want to take up the practice of test fitting each club as you go along. Let's say one of the shafts is a little looser than the rest, so you get a little bit more play or the shaft wiggles back and forth. Well, you can solve this problem by using shafting beads or fine particles that act as fillers. But don't make the mistake of adding shafting beads to the whole batch of epoxy, because some shafts may be tight and adding shafting beads will just make matters worse. Just scrape off some of the epoxy to the side and add a very small portion of the shafting beads, like in the order of 4 to 6% by volume. It won't take much, just like a little pinch. But too much will start to affect the strength of the epoxy. And then once you're done, just mix as I just described earlier. Now you want to spend some extra time before you leave while the epoxy cures. You want to look at the shaft and the head, checking for any excess epoxy. Wipe away any of the excess epoxy with a paper towel moistened with solvent at this point. Now double check that there's no space left between the ferrule and the head, if one is so required. And finally, recheck the silkscreen position, that it's in the correct position, and set the club aside with the head on the floor to dry, or with the club placed horizontally on a drying rack. These are a few cleanup tips that will help you from a more difficult task later on. Once epoxy is dried, it's there for good. No solvent will remove it after it cures. That's one of the key points to build clubs professionally, is neatness. Okay, here's a recap of some do's and don'ts. I'll wait for the slide to change. Okay, there we go. Use only an appropriate epoxy, not glue, for the job. A 24-hour epoxy is always encouraged over a fast-setting epoxy, as the shear strength is higher and less likely to fail. Shafts should be properly abraded, and you can view our shaft abrasion webinar for some helpful tips there. You want to clean all parts from oil or epoxy residue in the case of reshafting or repair. Acetone works well for this, but allow it to evaporate before applying any epoxy. Make sure to completely mix your epoxy and it's not possible to overmix unless it's very fast setting. And use epoxy sparingly. Don't think that if a little is good, a lot is better. Otherwise, it could lead to potential breakage. Shafting beads may help act as a filler when the shaft is slightly loose inside the hosel, but don't use epoxy and shafting beads to take up large differences, such as trying to install a 335 shaft into a 350 hosel or a 355 taper tip into a 370 parallel bore, as the epoxy was not designed to hold those large of a gap. You want to carefully mix epoxy in the proper proportion and clean up leftover epoxy from the clubs as well as your workbench and even your mixing stick. Some of the don'ts: don't rush your work, even if you've done it 1,000 times before. Let epoxy cure in cold temperature unless you factor that into when you can safely hit the club. And lastly, move assembled parts before they begin to set up. One other thing I might add is about storage. You want to store your epoxy somewhere where it's going to remain reasonably warm. If you store your epoxy out in a garage or a shed, you'll need to warm it up in the wintertime to be able to use it. And lastly, some epoxies have a lifespan, depending on if there's any fillers inside. You should buy only enough that you're going to be able to use up within a year. Typically after a year, it's going to start losing its strength. After 2 years, I would use it strictly for things around the house or shop that may need a quick fix, but never to epoxy head and shaft together. It's better to be safe than sorry, and epoxy doesn't cost that much compared to a lawsuit. Well, that's a wrap on epoxy. Let's turn this back over to Rob, and we can answer your questions in the time we have remaining.
Great. Another great presentation, Jeff, on epoxy. Just a few notes here. This webinar was recorded, and it will be on youtube.com/HirikoGolf, and also on our blog at blog.hirikogolf.com. All right, great. We have some questions coming in. First one is from Beeler. How important is it to either use a reamer or stiff brush to clean the hosel before installing the shaft?
I think on new club assembly, it'll never hurt, but the way that the foundries bore out the hosels, I don't think it's really required. But if you're going to do any sort of repair or reshaft, I would highly recommend it to get the old epoxy out and clean it the best you can.
All right, John asks, looking at the Hireko website, I see the 24-hour epoxy has lap shear strength of 4,500 psi as opposed to 2,900 psi for quickset. However, I only see quickset available in syringe form. Does Hireko sell this higher lap shear strength version in syringe form?
In the syringe or the bottles? What was that, Rob?
He says, does Hireko sell the higher lap shear strength version in syringe form?
There's actually 3 types of fast setting epoxy. There's the 8 poly AB or HB, and that comes in the 8-ounce bottles. That's got the 2,900 or 3,000 psi. That's good stuff. The cartridges are available, and that is the EPO6, and that's about the same, but it's in the smaller cartridges. The 40